Student Council, McGill Debating Union, Political Science Students Association, Political Bouillon, and the International Justice Portfolio, which is part of the Human Rights Working Group at the Faculty of Law. None of this would have been possible without all of your help and your hard work.
So we are going to begin. So we're going to start off with an opening address from Chaplaincy Services. I'll be introducing Neil Whitehouse, who's a reverend, as well as Manjeet Singh, who is the state chaplain. Oh, and one more thing. If anybody has any questions about the McGill Interfaith Student Council, please feel free to let us know. We will be sticking around after the event. So,
Also, to let you guys know, this event is being recorded. So if you want to check it out again, we'll be posting a link on the Facebook event page. And we're going to be appreciating it right now. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Tricia. As you mentioned, the initiative for this fine gathering comes from, in part, the McGill Interfaith Student Council. But where does that group come from? They were invited to form by a student called Francois, who last February went to Chicago. Francois was a member of a smaller group, the Interfaith Forum, which is a group of students that meet together informally to talk about their beliefs and ideas, knowing that they're going to meet students who are different from them. And Francois went to a conference of students across North America who were already engaged in interfaith action. He came back saying, we need an interfaith student council at McGill. And here we are. And who would have thought this would be our first event and so many people? In part, it's good, in part, it's a problem. So my question is, why are you here? That's part of the answer. Another is chaplaincy services. Next semester will be renamed to Religious and Spiritual Life, which is a little clearer. We're part of student services. Chaplaincy has a history that's older than student services itself. We're a team of 10 chaplains from different religious backgrounds. We have a director, Sarah, who's here today, and a coordinator, Jose, and a team of volunteers, and we offer, well, we have a fabulous lounge with lavish, that is free, coffee, and a meditation room, and it's in the Student Services building. Come and make use of it. Enjoy the hospitality. It's thanks to students that walked a labyrinth, walking meditation experience, that the Interfaith Forum was formed. And it's the Interfaith Forum that asks the council to form. So one thing leads to another. Why are you here? Knowledge through science and technology is bringing extraordinary power to change the future to be a global village. Well, we're almost like that here. But what are our values that guide this power, this extraordinary power? I believe we need to treasure our inheritance and diversity. We need to know our values, and above all, we need to grow in empathy. We need to practice and grow in empathy, to go beyond reactions to visible religious signs and our prejudices. We need to practice dialogue. We need to know our neighbours and their values. We need government and education that encourages this rather than accepting ignorance and prejudice. So thank you for coming, and it's now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Manjeet Singh, former Director of Chaplaincy Services and Sikh Chaplain at McGill, and he'll address more directly the challenge of the Quebec Charter.
Neil. This is indeed a pleasure for me to come here and share my ideas about this infamous charter proposal. Looking at my turban, I think you can all guess very easily where I stand on this issue. Lots of experts have spoken about this proposal, people who are much better qualified than I am. And this includes academics, psychologists, psychiatrists, political leaders, and even the two former premiers of Quebec who were head of the Parti Québécois. Then the Human Rights Commission of Quebec, they have spoken. Some lawyers have written about it. Julius Gray, who is the leading constitutional lawyer based here in Montreal, he has written a beautiful piece saying that this thing will never go through the courts. So everybody is saying that this is not something that is going to go anywhere. But like a drunken sailor, the PQ leadership is saying, let's go all the way. So what am I going to say, since everybody else who's more qualified than I am have already said it? I have two things to bring to your attention. First, a little bit about this law in France, Laïque, that was passed in 1905, where the state and the church were separated. Now, at that time, the decision makers in France did not say anything regarding the form of dress for the Catholic priests or nuns. All the way till the 1960s, when Vatican II took place, the nuns and priests in France were dressing themselves in the traditional clothes. And then after the Vatican II, they started to change. But this was not mandated by the government. And this is a very important thing I think we should keep in consideration. The government of Quebec wants to mandate things, so I keep asking myself, well, what's the difference between Parti Québécois and the party that Lenin and Stalin and Mao Zedong and Castro led? They mandated things, and people had to endure the suppression backed by the state power. So is Parti Québécois heading the same way? Things always start with small steps. Same thing happened in Germany before the start of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Things started to happen a little bit here, a little bit there, and all these sparks then blew up into a huge flame. My second point is that so far everybody has focused on the contents of this proposal. People are picking certain specific clauses or lines and saying this is not right according to that law of the land and so on. But nobody has asked how come particular Quebecois government is not following a proper process. And by that I mean that when you play with the fundamental law of the land, it's not the same thing as ordinary laws, which are more categorized as operational laws. The fundamental laws have a different requirement for changing. For example, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Canadian Constitution, a Prime Minister with an absolute majority in the House cannot change that just because he or she likes to do it. There is a process for that, to amend the Constitution. I know Quebec does not have a written Constitution, but the human rights law of Quebec that was enacted in 1976 through the unanimous consent and support of all political parties in the National Assembly. And what do we have here? A minority government saying we're going to change the law of the land, the basic principles on which our society operates. Can they do that? Nobody has raised that issue. And I'm making a plea that all the experts should reflect on this, on the process part. It's not just the Canadian Constitution. If you look at the US system, the 2/3 of the US Congress can pass a law and then submit it to the states, and 2/3 of the states have to approve it before the constitutional amendment comes into effect. What about France, which is the source of spiritual inspiration for particular Quebecois? But in France, they also have a process. The government can present in the House, pass a law, then they have to submit it for a referendum. Not like what particular Quebecois wants to do. So what I am saying is the basic contention of my argument is that particular Quebecois is playing crass politics. There is no sense of public morality in their thinking. All they want to do is gain a majority. But they forget that even if they have a majority, because they want to change the fundamental law, they cannot do it without the consent of the people. And that is basically my main point. And I have also looked at Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium. They all have a process for amending basic law. And so we need to make some noise to tell particular Quebecois that stop making fools of people and be real. Thank you very much.
Great time to put your phone on silent.
So welcome everyone. I'm Yusef Rahmani and I'm also part of the Interfaith Council. So as you all know, there's a debate coming up right now. So I'm going to introduce the people who will be debating. So on the right, the left side for you, there is going to be the debaters who are debating against the motion. Actually, no, for the motion. Sorry about that. So that's going to be Professor Robert Lackey and Ezra Cohen. And on your right side is going to be, the people debating against the motion. So Professor Mark Rowley from the Political Science Department. Sorry, I actually forgot to introduce the Professor. Robert Lackey is from the Law Faculty. So that's debating for the Charter. And the debating against the Charter is Professor Mark Rowley from the Political Science Department. And Mwanza Chimbalaga, right? Sorry about that, I'm terrible with names. So round of applause, please. And our moderator and speaker for tonight is Alex Langer, who is in the center. So round of applause.
All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to this round of debate. The motion before the House today is, be it resolved, this House believes that it is the legitimate goal of the state to enforce secularism in the public sphere. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister, Ezra Cohen, to introduce the proposition case that stands in his name in a speech lasting no longer than 7 minutes, the first and last minutes of which are protected time. Hear, hear.
Hello? Okay, hi everyone, can you hear me in the back? Nope, too loud? Oh man, it's like right in my face. Okay, yeah, everyone good? So before I start, I want to thank everyone who allowed me to be here and debate in front of people. Always a pleasure. I want to say one thing. The views represented by me and the coming speech are not necessarily my actual political views. That is actually irrelevant. You will be convinced that they are if I do my job correctly, but they are not in any way, or they might be, you don't know. The beliefs that I will hold, I think that is true for all the professors and debaters in this round, but I obviously can't speak for them, but you shouldn't assume that it is, or that it isn't. You should let them tell you personally, because we're ideological mercenaries in the debate. Okay, everyone ready? Just keep talking forever. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the House. We believe today on site government that the Quiet Revolution was vital in bringing Quebec to the prosperous society it is today, that it was a vital step forward in terms of allowing the prosperity and longevity and legitimacy of the Quebec government. We also believe that multiculturalism is this province's future, in the sense that allowing for Quebec that is truly a global village, as the chaplain said, is going to be necessary for this province and its people to thrive moving forward. That being the case, we are proud to present this motion that Alex just read to you. So, what are we actually going to be defending? We will not be defending the specifics of the Charter regarding the ban on religious people, on religious garb. I know you're all disappointed, I'm going to talk about why. We think that a far more interesting debate and a far more interesting discussion is the principle behind what the PQ is trying to do. A far more interesting discussion is whether or not these means are legitimate. Are the ends that they seek desirable ends? Is the vision of society that they wish for a desirable vision of society? We believe very firmly that it is. We believe very firmly that secularism as a government policy is good and necessary, both for the prosperity of people who live in this province and those who might live here in the future. So, what are we talking about specifically? We believe, actually, as according to the opening preamble of the Charter, which reads, "The National Assembly of Quebec affirms the values of separation of religions and the state, and the religious neutrality and secular nature of the state." That's what we're talking about, that's what we're defending, that's what this debate is about today. Let's talk about why. So first, we believe that consistent with the protection of basic individual rights and liberties, states can and should take a proactive role in changing and improving the societies in which they live. We believe that states can and should strive to change what are fundamental laws of the place in which, oh, this is highly variable, can and should strive to change fundamental laws of the provinces and states in which they reside for the benefits of all citizens, assuming that individual liberties are in fact maintained. We believe in our side of the house in state projects. We believe in our side of the house that it is the role of a socialized state, so far as we all buy into it, to try actively to improve the lives of all those who reside in it. That's the stance we take on our side of the house, and we're going to prove to you why secularism is just such a goal. What are we talking about specifically? We think that Quebec, but the analysis can be applied elsewhere, should do two things as quickly as it possibly can. First, it should make all efforts to remove religious symbols from public institutions, crosses on schools, the crucifix in the General Assembly, literally everything. It's on a public institution, take it down. If it has genuine artistic or cultural value, lovely, put it in a museum. If it doesn't, recycle it or auction it. Two, we tell you that we should end tax exemptions for religious institutions. This is to say, your church should not be subsidized. You give to that church, it's like giving to your local squash club. Makes no difference to us. But one thing we will say is that if you run a food bank out of your mosque or church, that can still be subsidized. We don't think that the religious practice should be at all. We don't think it serves compelling state interest. We will run you today with 4 constructive arguments in the next 4 minutes plus my partner's speech. First, I tell you that religious symbols, meaning in public spaces, meaningfully alienate individuals who do not ascribe to those symbols. Second, we'll tell you that the existence of religious symbols in public spaces demonstrate divided loyalties among those who ascribe to a system of belief. Third, I'll tell you that tax exemptions for institutions do not serve any sort of compelling state interest, and neither do religious behavior. My partner will tell you why we get better religiosity on our side of the house. Let's get into it. So first, we know that symbols matter. Right? Symbols make a difference. We think that waving that a swastika is far more than a bunch of lines. We think that a cross is far more than a T. Right? We think that there is a symbolism behind a notion or an object or an image, or even an article of clothing, is far more significant than just the cloth or the lines that article of clothing is made out of. Why does this matter? Because when the state erects a religious symbol onto a public space, we think that it sends a very clear message. It says that to be Quebecois is to be Catholic. I'll take you in a second. We think that in Turkey, the existence of the crescent on the flag sends a very clear message that though it is a secular state in name, to be truly Turkish, you need to have some association with that system of belief. We think that's problematic. Yes?
But Ezra, don't you agree that the state generally doesn't just erect them, that they have some sort of historical, symbolic value to the society that it's expressing?
Great. It totally does have historical value, as I described to you. We just don't care. We think that the responsibility of governments should be to their current citizenry, not their past citizenry. And we think the responsibility of government should be to serving the citizens who come in the future and to prove a better and improved society overall. So who is alienated by this specifically? 3 groups. First, we tell you that people who do not have any sort of religious obligation, secular people, atheist people, who are then unable to engage with the state because the notion of the good life that they have rejected is put to them anytime they seek to interact, either in the National Assembly or in a place where they would vote. We tell you that these people cannot actually engage as well with the state. They are pushed out of the state. They are told your way of life is worse. To be in this province is to be this way. So my second group, which is people who are in minority religious situations, right? People who are not actually the plurality. Every time they interact in Quebec, they are generally in a Catholic Quebec. We think that it is important for Jews and Muslims and Sikhs and anyone else who you plan to pick to be able to say that I am just as Quebecois as anyone else in support of multiculturalism. And finally, actually, I'm not going to talk about this. My partner's going to talk about lapsed Catholics and all the terrible things that the Catholic Church did in Quebec. So, let's talk about the existence of religious symbols in public spaces in terms of divided loyalties among individuals. We note that we agree again with the Charter that it is true that many religions hold systems of values, systems of beliefs that do not correlate perfectly with those of a secular society. Many religions and many systems of belief hold values that are distinctly contrary to those the state holds. And more than that, we think that individuals often hold both at the same time. We think there are Catholic members of Parliament. We think there are, or National Assembly, excuse me. There are Catholic members of National Assembly. There are, go back to Turkey for a second, deeply Islamic members of Turkish Parliament. What's the problem? Because when there is a national symbol there, it reactivates a notion of self that is a deeply religious notion of self. And this says, oh, I should be reminded I am in fact a Christian. I am in fact a Muslim. And I should therefore act or vote or change the world to look in a Muslim or Christian way. We think that when you are sitting in Parliament, or National Assembly, you should be thinking not about serving God, not about serving Catholics, not about serving any specific group of people, but rather Quebecois on the whole, about serving the entirety of our society, regardless of the religion which they come from, and regardless of your own personal religious beliefs. We think that as long as that symbol is there, it is impossible to ask people to do so, and the likelihood of people voting along their religious lines rather than their actual lines for the good of the state is limited. Finally, let's talk about why religions do not serve the interest of the state. We give tax exemptions to things that we think also serve good state interest, right? Also things like charities that the state, a service they need to provide. We tell you that religions are by their nature closed, which is to say, if I am not a believing Muslim, I get very little utility from a mosque. If I'm not a believing Catholic, I get very little utility from a Catholic church. That being the case, we think that states should only be sponsoring and only be giving a literal subsidy to those organizations and institutions that are open to all members of society all the time for any reason. We're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that address. I'd like to invite the member to give a 7-minute address. Thank you.
So before I get started too, I would like to thank who organized this event. It's a great idea to get people out talking about it, and thank you for including me in this. So, are you ready, Alex? All right, I am ready. The government, in making its case, tried to separate at the very beginning means and ends. This is a classic example of doublespeak. And I will do something my students should never do, which is quote Wikipedia at the very beginning of something. Doublespeak is defined by Wikipedia as language that deliberately disguises, distorts, or reverses the meaning of words. And that is exactly what is going on here. The last part of that, reverse the meaning of words. It's really hard to pull that off, but that's what the government is going to try to do with this resolution. Because it's about secularism. And so we have to think about what secularism really means and what is the intent of the resolution. It means you have to think about the means involved as well. Secularism should mean that the state is neutral, that it does not favor or promote one particular religion, that it does not discriminate in its actions on the basis of religion. Individuals, therefore, would be free to practice whatever religion they choose, or be atheist if they choose as well. Of course, there are always limits in society to what you can do, but we put those limits on individuals, not on the basis of their religion, but on whether it starts to impinge on other people's freedoms, other people's rights. Let's use that same standard here to think about how the rules would be applied or enforced. Therefore, the mechanisms really matter in this. If you think about either the symbols involved, the organizations that we're talking about, what you have to look at is how the resolution would be influencing them. And that's where we have to think about what the intent really is behind this. So first, I am going to talk about wearing symbols in different jobs and so forth. If you wear something, does it really take away someone else's rights? If there is a symbol somewhere, is it really offending those people to the extent that they are losing something? You're putting the onus there on whoever's viewing something. They get to define what is offensive, not you, not somebody else. And of course, this is going to be arbitrary in practice. It's going to be arbitrary because at the one moment in the discussion in the public sphere, what we're having outside of this hall, people will point and say, we know, a headscarf is a symbol of some kind of religion, and therefore it's going to be part of this discussion. I threatened to bring some pictures in here and didn't, but if I put up a slide right now, what I would have would be a picture of a guy wearing a hand-crocheted woolly tam that had 3 colors in it, and you would all look and recognize Rastafari. What's the government going to do? Tell this person to take that tam off. Then what are you going to see? A guy with dreadlocks. And what are you going to think? Rastafari. So what are we going to do next? Cut his hair. Well, it's not about the length of hair. It's about something else here. Sorry. Not a debater, sorry. Just stick with my speech. So, second point here on symbols. Some symbols are, by their nature, religious, but the way people use them are not particularly about spreading religion. Newsflash to the government. Lady Gaga wears a cross, not because she's trying to convert people to Christianity. Have the freedom to choose to wear certain things based on style or whatever. Some people wear these things as a form of mockery. I mentioned Rastafarians a minute ago. Look up Pastafarians on the internet, and you will discover people who are mocking religion. What do? They wear spaghetti strainers on their head. So go ahead and start outlawing that and coming up with other ways to limit the use of pasta strainers. I just think this resolution would be impossible to enforce in any sensible way, because what you're trying to do is infer things by viewing it, infer things about the intent of the other person on the basis of what? I mean, this is a simple question. When is a headscarf a religious symbol, and when is it a scarf? That is something that the state says it's going to determine for you. Thank you, but no thank you. When is a cross ostentatious? When is it not? We're going to have some Quebec-style police telling you, your cross is simple, it's okay. No, your cross is ostentatious, it's not. They're going to be out trying to measure the sizes of your cross before you go lecture. I don't know. You would think that in Quebec, of all places, they would know that when you try to do things like legislate the use of the word pasta on Italian menus, it's going to make you look stupid. And that's where we're headed with this resolution. Even if we look at religious organizations and tax-exempt status, the same principles should be applied as what I said about symbols. It's about what behavior you're seeing. It's not about where the organization comes from. If the organization is based on a neighborhood, or whether it's based on a group that belongs to the same church, it doesn't matter. What matters is the work they're doing charitable work or not? Are they discriminating in their practices? That's all fine to regulate, but to just sort of say, well, because your organization started in a particular fashion, we're going to change your status. Or to say, I mean, we could talk about the Red Cross. Their symbol seems to be, not allowed. Is that what Quebec is going to be saying? Finally, and I think the most important point of all is the one I raised at the very beginning, about doublespeak. You have to think about the practical impact this particular resolution would have if it was enforced. It's going to have the exact opposite impact of secularism. Secularism is supposed to be about the neutrality of the state. And in fact, what this would do is empower the state in its hiring practices and in other places to discriminate on the basis of religion. There are lots of jobs at stake in the public sector in Quebec. This is saying, oh, the government can choose who to hire and who to fire based on how visible their status is, their religious beliefs are. That is exactly the opposite of what secularism should mean. I think George Orwell perhaps said it best. He wrote this lovely essay you can go read on politics in the English language. I don't know, he didn't use French, I guess, but he would undoubtedly love it here in Quebec. He wrote, political language is designed, and I'm paraphrasing here actually, political language is designed to make lies sound truthful. And I think that's exactly what we have here, a case of doublespeak, where you do have to worry about the means and the ends. Secularism is about neutrality of the state, and that's what we should really be talking about. So thank you.
I'd like to invite Professor Leckie up to give a 7-minute address.
Thank you so much. It's great to see so many people here at this point in the term. It's always terrifying to respond to a case grounded primarily on Wikipedia, but I have 7 minutes and I'm going to give it by message. So I'll be reconstructing the government's case tonight. I'll be reminding you what precisely our proposition is, the way we interpreted it, the way it was set out. I'll be delivering the promised new points to give the Leader of the Opposition time to digest and chew those over. So the Prime Minister promised that I had a couple more things to add to his case. So before I remind you of the entire case, who is alienated by the presence of religious symbols as we see them in Quebec society? When I go to vote for mayor a couple of weeks ago in a publicly funded public school that happens to be a French language institution, a massive cross is hanging on the outside of the building. Who is alienated by that? He spoke about people who are members of minority religions, people who are members of no religious affiliation, whose understanding of the good life doesn't involve organized religion. But in this province in particular, a large number of people alienated are themselves lapsed Catholics, wounded Catholics, Catholics for whom their direct experience with these symbols is such that it is troubling, not to say disturbing, to see the government continuing to be sponsoring them in our public spaces. You're saying to yourself, but of course people don't have a right not to be disturbed. or people don't have the right not to see reminders of some loyalty they once had. And it's true. If you were a fan of one hockey team and later changed your mind, you wouldn't have much of a claim that you were bothered by seeing posters and signs for that team. But the context of the Roman Catholic Church in this province is actually rather different. The degree of involvement it had in the state, the coercive power it exercised through the health institutions, through the schools, through its alliance with government, is such that there are a number of people who, for very reasonable and justifiable reasons, I think, raised as Catholics, could be bothered by the continuing prevalence of religious symbols that they see all around them in government-funded, government-maintained spaces. So that's another group, certainly, that the proponents in the National Assembly don't talk about very much, and it would support our case tonight. And the final new point that was promised by the Prime Minister is that a state pursuit of secularism, an intentional state program of being even-handed, of not promoting one religion over another, or not even promoting religiosity, that is, organized religion over other forms of spirituality, or over another absence of spirituality, that's also better for the religions themselves. One could argue that the Catholic Church made a bad turn when it got into bed with the Roman Empire a long, long time ago. And one doesn't need to argue that religious people should be thrown to the lions in order to say that it might be worth sort of rolling back things and reminding people that religion is intended to be countercultural. Religion is intended to be difficult. Belonging to a religion is intended to involve sacrifices at times, rather than feeling that the state is in your back pocket and that your images are being promoted and preserved and disseminated on your behalf. It's actually bad for the religions. And even the tax-exempt status. I mean, it's hard to look money in a, it's hard to turn away money. But fundamentally, I believe that the organized religions currently subsidized through their tax-exempt status in this province would be better, would be freer to pursue their own deepest objectives if they weren't being subsidized the way they are today. Would it be easier to sell an old, empty building that is not filled on Sunday mornings, that may be half filled at Easter and Christmas, if you were actually paying the proper property taxes that any other building in that neighborhood were paying? I would suggest that the current process we have distorts even the decisions, not to mention the religious sentiment within religions. So those are the new ideas. Our program of a state even-handedness, a state refusal to support one kind of religious belonging over another, and a deliberate state program to attempt to change the visible face of our society such that the state is not endorsing religion. That would be better even for religious people themselves. So I want to remind you of the case we have. We said, the Prime Minister said out very clearly, we're not interested in telling individual people what to wear. We think it was interesting and constructive tonight to try to take seriously the premises of the Government of Quebec's project. The Government of Quebec's project says the state should not be endorsing religion, and latent in that, implicit in that, is the notion that the state can actually be actively trying to change the society a little bit. And so we disagree with the notion, for example, that the Quebec Charter was perfect the way it was introduced in 1975 and that it can't be fundamentally changed or discussed. We think states can have projects. We think states can take purposive measures to attempt to implement their values, provided that they respect individual liberties. And we believe that one such project would be trying to remove the religious symbols of our past that we see around us, and being even-handed by not shoveling out cash through various kinds of tax exemptions. The Prime Minister reminded you that religious symbols alienate. And the member of the opposition said, of course, symbols mean different things, and it's true. A Muslim woman may wear a headscarf for one reason or for another. But honestly, when you see the big cross on the outside of the public school, and you know it was put there in 1960, when the whole school board was run still by the church, I don't think there's a lot of debate about what that means. Or some people say, well, maybe it's a compass, north, south, east, west. No, people know it's a cross. And people know it is there as a reminder of the church's grip on our society. So I think, while individually worn symbols may lend themselves to different interpretations, we know pretty clearly what the cross in the National Assembly means. We know pretty clearly what the cross on Mount Royal means. And we know pretty plainly what the crosses on many of our hospitals mean. They are reminders of church domination. And for many people who preserve them, they would like to go back there. And so I think it's reasonable to say that the state has a role in changing our society. And the Prime Minister said eloquently, we can transition these things into museums, and if they're not worth the stone or metal they're made out of, it's time for them to go. And of course, none of that has any impact on individuals' religious choices in the property they own, or rent, or otherwise occupy. So the government case tonight invites you to take a position. Can government dream? Can government try to make society better? Can government say we are not shackled to our past? We are open to a wide variety of conceptions of the good life. And put it more bluntly, we do not believe that the majority of a province has any kind of defensible stake in simply having their religious heritage still be present. We do not believe that that is legitimate. The fact that it's always like that, the fact that that's how things were in the past, we do not believe that that is a justifiable distributive principle or decorative principle or anything like that. We believe that a genuinely even-handed secular state would change the symbols we see around us, would try to limit its expenditures to things which are defensible in the terms of public reason, defensible to people whether or not they form part of organized religion. And so for these compelling reasons, the Prime Minister's case as well, we invite you to support the government's motion.
I'd like to thank Professor Leckie for that address. I'd like to invite Mwanza to deliver a 10-minute address and close out the opposition.
So I'm not going to use this mic because I have an extraordinarily loud voice, as I've been told by lots of people. If I, for some reason, become quiet, just let me know and I will speak up. All right. So, what am I going to do today? So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you guys, what does secularism really mean? From what we've heard from government is this idea that secularism inherently means that the government has to enforce basically atheism amongst the public. We think that on our side of the house, what's really important is allowing everybody to express their freedoms. Now, what they want to tell you is basically, well, we think that individuals have the ability to do this, but it shouldn't be allowed in the public sphere. I'm going to ask you a little bit later about what is the public sphere and how does that really work into this. But first what I'm going to do is go through some thorough refutation of what they've said, and then I'll get into some thematic ideas of what this round is really about. So the first thing that we heard from the Prime Minister is this idea that multiculturalism is culture, and what's super important for Quebec is this idea of multiculturalism, integrating that into society. But the thing is that we firmly believe that a lot of multiculturalism is based in this idea of religious freedom and being able to express that in a public way. We think that the moment in which you limit the way in which people and groups can express that freedom, that you actually limit multiculturalism, and they have failed to defend that on their side of the house. Next, they talk to you about this idea of state projects and how it's important that the state not be engaged in active religious symbolism. I raised to the Prime Minister on the POI this idea of the fact that the reality is that the state is currently not erecting religious symbols. But the vast majority of the religious symbols that are around, that exist, are actually religious symbols that have some sort of historical value. But what we've heard from them is that, well, that doesn't really matter. We don't really care, they should just be put in a museum. But we actually think that a lot of the reason that we care about heritage symbols in Quebec and in Canada in general is because of the fact that we think that they are actually part of our cultural identity. Even at the point at which they may have some sort of negative connotation, we think that it's an important discussion point and that they need to be allowed to exist and to still be part of our identity. Sure.
If the heritage they represent is a heritage that says that to be Quebecois, you have to be Catholic, is that a heritage you think the government should defend?
So I actually just don't think that that's at all the heritage that they represent. I think that what they do represent is where Quebec has come from. And the reality is that Quebec did form and was formed as a French Catholic colony, and that people here were actually ostracized and left out of the majority of Canada because of being oppressed minorities in their Catholic views. We think that it is actually an important part of their heritage to not destroy those symbols, but to allow them to keep existing in the one basic area where French Catholics are still allowed to exist and be part of a province of their own. So then they talk about this idea of minority religions and how there are certain people who are being cast out from what we think are kind of the right kind of religious symbols. But what we think that what they've offered you is really not a better view What they've just told you is to simply get rid of all religious symbols in the public sphere. But we think that the best way for all religions, including the minority religions, to be able to protect their rights and to practice is for them to also be able to engage in the public sphere, not to withdraw, to make religion a private thing. Because we actually think on our side of the house that that's just not the case. We think that religion is a shared experience. It's something that people engage in a public way, and that what they're doing is they're actually limiting the way in which people can engage with it. Then they talk to you about this idea of about how they want to limit what religious organizations and services, etc., can receive in terms of tax dollars. But what they fail to understand, they first of all try to separate the duties and the responsibilities of religious organizations from the religious organizations themselves. So they give you the example of the food bank. We actually think that it's extraordinarily difficult, for one, to separate the two. We think that fundamentally, most religious groups and organizations are based thoroughly in their dedication to charity, and charity work is a part of like a church or a mosque or any other religious group that exists. But we think that even if that weren't the case, the thing is that each of these churches and each of these groups actually have an ability to do something for those individuals, to provide a service that the government cannot provide. That they have the ability to actually help people philosophically, mentally, and spiritually in a way that the government cannot provide. And we think that the way in which for the government to best be able to fund and promote secularism and freedom for everybody is for them to equally fund all of the different religions and all of the different beliefs and spiritualities, as opposed to not funding any of them, and necessarily meaning that they don't have the same abilities. Yeah.
Many people don't belong to any church or religion and yet still live long and fulfilling lives. Aren't these people meaningfully disenfranchised when the state only funds one and not the other?
So the thing is that there is no Church of the Atheist. If there were an atheist group that was providing those kinds of services for people, if they were like, counseling people before marriage, or just generally counseling people as to when they've done something bad and giving them help, etc., we would totally be okay with them funding them as well and giving them tax exemptions. It just doesn't exist. We do think that where it does exist, and where we do have the ability to do so, we should absolutely do it. And keep in mind that tax exemption is not exactly like giving them money. It's just not making them pay taxes on it. There's a very different thing, and we think that that needs to be recognized by the proposition. So then they talk about the idea of religiosity is bad and how the state needs to be even-handed. But I already discussed that it's extraordinarily important that the state, in order to really allow for secularism, be involved in helping all of the different religions and not simply not helping any of them out. So, I want to ask you 3 questions. First, what is secularism? Second, what is the public sphere? And third, what is the role of the government? So, we hear from Professor Volley this idea of what secularism is, and whether it's the idea of the state versus religion, or whether it's the state neutrality with regards to religion. What we think is important is that in this particular case, the state neutrality necessarily means allowing things to exist under the status quo. We don't think that state neutrality is any way served by actively forcing religious icons and religious views out of the public sphere. Which brings me to the second question: what is the public sphere? We haven't had a very good definition from their side of the house of what the public sphere is, which means that in theory, we could have all sorts of different religions, not just majority religions like they want you to believe, not just Catholics, but actually Muslims, Jews, all sorts of other groups being actively told that their religious symbols may not be displayed in public because it is offensive to others. On our side of the house, we don't think that that's an acceptable stance. We think that you are thoroughly infringing upon another person's ability to practice their religion when you are telling them that it is not okay for their group to actively display the symbols of their religion in a public way. We don't think that's acceptable. Then the third question is, what is the role of the government in these kinds of scenarios? We think that it is the government's job to protect and to promote the freedoms of the individuals and of those groups. Now, at the point at which it is their responsibility to protect those freedoms, we think that that also means allowing them to express those freedoms in whichever way they see fit. So if a school decides that it is important to either their history or to to display a particular religious symbol, that we think that it is within their right to do so. We don't think that it is the government's job to come in and tell people how to practice their religion in an acceptable way. So what have you heard from us today? We've talked to you about symbols and religion and how they're important to the way in which people express themselves, and how even if you take the individual level out of it, on a group level, it necessarily means that people are unable to express their religious values, and how a secular state necessarily means allowing everyone to express those values and not simply to shut them off. Second, we talked to you about the function of religious groups and how they have severe social functions that the state does not necessarily fulfill, and how it is important to support those functions, and that we'd be okay if they did that for atheists as well. And then we also talked to you about the implications of implementation, and about the fact that that the implementation of such a bill would mean not allowing people to hold their views. And for all of those reasons, we firmly beg to a close. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We note on our side of the House, let's talk about what side opposition tells us. They tell you that secularism means treating all states equally, that the status quo is necessary to maintain state neutrality between the various different religions that exist in our society. In the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, the state is hardly neutral. And the status quo is not only not neutral between different religious groups, it is not even neutral between religious groups and irreligious ones. I'll talk about that in a second. We note that in the status quo, you do not see in this province Jewish stars and sickles and crescent moons on various different public institutions. You see crosses. There is not a Jewish star in the General Assembly. But more than that, we tell you that even if this outside of Quebec, that the state maintaining the status quo is paramount to endorsement of that which currently is in power and that which was in power historically. They tell you about that it was a French Catholic colony, this important notion of identity. Note the second word of French Catholic colony, right? Not a French multicultural colony, not a French colony open and welcome to all people of different religious beliefs, a French Catholic colony. For people who are not Catholic and yet seek to live here and thrive here, I think the message that it sends is very clear, that they cannot be fully integrated. They are not fully Quebecois. We think on our side of the House that insofar as what should happen in the public sphere, what should the interaction be between states and governments? We think it's very simple. Sorry, between states and religions, right? Very simple. We think that states should take the following stance. All religions, at all times, will be treated equally under the law, will be treated equally in the public sphere, by which we mean the government services that they can receive and have access to, and that their members, when accessing those same venues of power through the ballot box or through the National Assembly, should know that they will be treated equally, and that members of Parliament will always act in their interests as well as the interests of people who happen to share their religion. In the context then of this charter, of this name of this event, we tell you this. If you want a Quebec that maintains individual liberty, that ensures that all people can actually belong here, can actually thrive here, can know that their religion is protected in this province, protected not only there, but then for their children in the long term and in the short run, there's only one way this debate can go. We think that the status quo is exactly what leads to the prejudicial nature that many people see in the ban on garments. We think that a better province, a better society, a better government, is one that has a clear idea. The idea being as follows. You do your religion, but if you don't have a religion, or your religion doesn't happen to be the same as everyone else's, that's okay too. And we will not be spending public funds or public energy in an effort to do so. To tell you about the importance for religious practice, I think Professor Leckie gives you the best analysis on this when he tells you, actually, religiosity is better on our side of the house. Religion can be pure when it is separated from the venues of government power. We think religion is pure and better, that the ability to transcend beyond just the people around you is you have greater access to when you don't actually have to worry about making sure everyone else abides by your own religious beliefs. Mr. Speaker, we stood for a lot in this debate, but we certainly stand proud to propose.
Can everybody hear me all right? Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. When I first saw that many people in the room, I thought this was a debate about Rob Ford and the use of crack cocaine. But then having heard Ezra, who speaks faster than I do, which was really quite unbelievable, I thought it would be helpful for us to talk about what's actually in the charter, because I know that's why you came. And why two of you came, and actually have an understanding of what is in this document, what it's about, and why both sides of the debate were right in different ways. The two things to know about, I think, this process. One of them is that I don't have any doubt that many of the people who are on the pro-charter side of the debate believe sincerely that what they are doing is the right thing and are not necessarily coming at this from a racist or discriminatory perspective. And I think for us to have a meaningful debate in this, we have to acknowledge that there are people of good faith on both sides of the debate, however profoundly we disagree. The second point I want to make, with all due respect to some of the first speakers, is that I think we need to be extremely careful about comparisons to Hitler and Stalin in this debate. Reductio ad Hitleritem, I think, is a really bad way of coming at these kinds of debates, particularly since I have no reason to believe, growing up in this province and being a proud Montrealer, Quebecer, and Canadian, that we should assume bad faith in our fellow citizens. Having said that, this bill is an extremely bad idea, and it doesn't fulfill the ideas of secularism, and it doesn't address the concerns that it's setting out to address. Should we have a secular society? Absolutely. But here's where we should have a secular society. We should not be living in a society where in order to aspire to be the Prime Minister of this country, you have to believe in the King of Kings. Our neighbors to the south are a slightly different matter. We should not be in a society where creationism is taught in the same way as evolution. We should not live in a society where any kind of museum is publicly subsidized to show dinosaurs walking around contemporaneously with human beings. We should not live in a society where science is affected in any way with regard to religious policy, and we should not live in a society where the personal beliefs of the Prime Minister or the Premier affect in any way the religious policies of the society in which we live. But that is not what this bill is about. And that is the problem with it. And that's why I think both sides of that house, as it were, I don't understand this debating thing. But I mean, they're intense, these people, right? It's a cult. But anyway, so this bill is really about, let's face it, this bill is about hijab. This bill is about the concern that political Islam and the obvious and real discrimination that women face, that many women face in developing countries where the government is Islamic, somehow is relevant to what's going on in Quebec. And let me start by saying that Quebec is not Yemen, and Quebec is not Egypt, and Quebec is not Turkey. We live in a country where people should not be able to bring their fights here.
And for the advocates and the feminists who come from Maghreb and tell people that women are being oppressed. Yes, of course women are being oppressed. But the way to depoliticize hijab is to allow people to wear it and to eliminate a patriarchal approach to telling women how to behave and to allow women and men to dress the way they want to dress. This bill is actually not about religious symbols. This bill has been amended in order to cover not only religious symbols, in other words, Kippa, Hijab, and whatever the other one was, but also to cover any form of clothing. Conspicuous is no longer or ostentatious is no longer in the bill. It's now about what is conspicuous and that is outwardly religious. So any clothing, symbol, or personal adornment, which would include a tattoo, a beard, that somebody who is not defined, not identified, and not subject to any judicial process that is circumscribed by law, deems to be religious, is prohibited in the public service. And not only is it prohibited in the public service, it's too many P's in a row for me, not only is it prohibited in the public service, but it is also prohibited for anybody who is working under contract with the government, who is appointed by the government. So this business about it being limited to the public service or limited to police or the fire or firefighters is simply inaccurate. And by the way, I think that people with turbans have been working in the RCMP. There's Supreme Court of Canada jurisprudence on this since 1995. It's been allowed. It was allowed in the RCMP prior to that. This was fought tooth and nail. Kirpans have been allowed in legislatures across the country, Ontario, British Columbia, since 1992. There's never been a problem. Sikhs fought bravely in the wars, wearing turbans. We were perfectly pleased to allow them as part of our military at the time, and now suddenly there's a problem. So this bill is a double whammy against Muslim women, not only with regard to the fact that they're Muslim, but also with regard to the fact that they're women, because men wearing beards are not going to be interrogated with regard to the reason why they're wearing a beard. Against Muslim women, it is going to, and it is going to discriminate against men wearing turbans. Now, I know there are turban wearers here who are more knowledgeable about this than I, but my understanding is that one of the 5 Ks is with regard to the long hair, the uncut hair, and not necessarily with regard to the way in which it is kept up. In other words, the turban per se there's different ways of retaining hair. It is not in itself religious. The hijab, or anybody who is wearing a head covering tonight, knows that there's no such thing in the Quran as a specific requisition to what you wear on top of your head. So therefore it's going to be okay to wear a Hermes scarf at work. It is not going to be okay to wear a simple black cotton scarf. Why? Because it is deemed to be religious, even if it isn't necessarily prescribed in a religious text. How are we going to tell the difference? How are we going to tell the difference between the Rasta, the person who wants to wear a headscarf, the person who likes headscarves, the person who's wearing a headscarf because they are Muslim or religious, and the person who's wearing a headscarf because they have cancer? How are we going to tell the difference? This bill also prohibits any form of religious accommodation, including taking time off work for holidays, including time off work during work periods, because it conditions the now legal requirement for equality that exists in the Supreme Court of Canada. It conditions it with a religious requirement that says you are entitled to refuse any religious request if we decide that it affects the neutrality of the public service. So this is not only about what you wear on your head. This is not only about what you wear on your body. This is also about the ability of people who are members of minority religions to work in the public service. And the accommodation requirement that is going to be permitted for religious minorities is going to be the only place in Canada where religious accommodation is treated differently than accommodation for any other area, including pregnant women, people with disabilities, and so on. The New York Times described this bill last week as Canada's Tea Party moment.
Wow.
And I'm sad to say that even though, as a feminist, as somebody who strongly believes in the promotion of French and the protection of the French language in Quebec, we were told over and over again after the Quiet Revolution that what mattered was not where you came from, what mattered was not who you were, what mattered was that you were able to function in the French language. And now we know from this government, from their perspective, that that is no longer true. And I would suggest to you that as you're thinking about how to respond to the bill as citizens, as students, as Montrealers, as people who want to be politically active, you need to be asking yourself, in closing, this question about, does the government really mean this, or is this merely a crass political ploy? Because when I get all excited about this from a legal perspective, people say, don't waste your energy. No, nobody's serious about this. This is just to provoke an election, and they said it was going to be a matter of confidence. So, at the end of the day, if it's going to be a matter of confidence, what I would suggest to you is that if this provokes an election, now we know what this government is planning to do in an independent Quebec. And if I were you, I would be concerned.
Hello. I think I want to broaden the question again. That is, I think it's very valuable that we're thinking about the situation before us here in Quebec, but I think it's also been useful this evening that at least some of the time we've been thinking in a broader way about how we think societies should be. Some of what's going on here in Quebec is very specific to Quebec. That's fun and interesting. But some of what's going on here in Quebec is something that either is or should be going on in every would-be liberal democracy. That is, I think right now, in every liberal democratic society, there is an inquiry happening about whether there are enough values that matter to enough citizens enough of the time to constitute a basis of social union. Are we just a random selection of people who somehow were shipwrecked on the island of Montreal and are trying to make the best of it? Or are we in some sense a society that does have shared values? I think it's quite an interesting question to be asking. Do we have enough shared values to live together? And then also to be asking whether the values that we share that could enable us to live together are those, as I think often the liberal political tradition assumes, are those necessarily our deepest values? And as I've been thinking about the search for Quebec values and why it either doesn't move me or even alienates me, the values that I think I want to share with you as you and I constitute a society, I think I want to share our most superficial values. I think I want to live in a society where the role of a really good government is to collect the garbage on time, or to protect the poor, or to pave the roads. Actually, I think actually, the pothole outside my house prevents people speeding. I think it has some utility. But that's another. I think that here in Quebec, because the population who lived through the Quiet Revolution share this deep religious, or in brackets, not religious experience, there's a stronger temptation than in most places to suppose that the values that should constitute society are the deep values. That's very rough on those of us who don't share them. I think, though, that in all of these discussions that are happening in Canada, that should be happening in other places, about whether there's enough for us to live together, I think that a positive approach to that is to say, can we find values that are superficial enough to let us actually work together as neighbors and enjoy the experience? That goes to that the state, in its long history, has usually not been anything remotely like religiously neutral. And I guess I confess, I think that a Quebec state founded on the rejection of a previous kind of Quebec state is probably incapable of being religiously neutral. That is, it's founded on a pendulum swing away from a previous non-neutrality towards a new non-neutrality. But I think that the kind of state that would be interesting to me would be one which would be secular in the fairly specific and negative sense. A state that recognizes that it is not beautiful or transcendent or noble, that it's right to ask me to die for it, has to be very closely tied to some really good reasons, and that claims my loyalty not on the basis of some essentially religious value, even if that essentially religious value in us all not being Catholic together. So that's the source of most of my disquiet about this proposed legislation, at the same time that I honor the seriousness of the problem behind it. Do we actually have enough in common to justify living together? Or should we shoot each other and get it over with? I think we can find enough to live together based on assigning parking spots, on doing business together. And doing business together, I'm trying to be quick on this, doing business together as principled people with indeed transcendent loyalties that are not transcendent loyalties to the state. And so doing business together at that superficial level as people who do have deep core values, they may not be the core values of any state. That's how I would like it to be.
Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I must say that I didn't really have a chance to prepare very much for this evening, so I'm going to say some things that I said originally when the proposals were introduced in early September. Before I do that, though, I wanted to say something to follow up on what Pearl was saying, which is that I really do encourage everyone to read the actual text of Bill 60. It's not that long, so it's not a huge reading assignment. I know you're all busy right now. But just, it didn't take me more than 20 minutes to read it, and I think that that's actually important because there are some significant changes. One thing that struck me when I read it was section 14, where basically they're talking about, rules of application, right? So one of the things that struck me about the proposal in September was there were no penalties stipulated for what would happen, if somebody did wear a religious symbol. I thought, well, if I wear a hijab into my lecture, as I did for 1 week, what would happen to me, right? So I thought, is it that I would pay a penalty? Is there some kind of fine that I would have to pay, or what would McGill do in that case? Would they support me, et cetera, et cetera? Or could I lose my job, right? So none of this was clear, and I thought that in this bill it would become clear. Now, section 14 says that at first failure by a personnel member of a public body, such as a university, to comply with the restriction on wearing a religious symbol, dialogue must be engaged in before any disciplinary measure is taken by the public body in order to remind the person of their obligations and foster their compliance.
Yes.
Okay, so I think what is the name of that person? Richard Dawkins, I think, when he was asked about the charter, he said it's dictatorial bossiness, And I thought, yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like. But Pearl has corrected me on this, that in fact this section is code, right? You're saying although it's not written, and so someone like me who doesn't usually read these kinds of bills and doesn't know how things in the public service, I just think, oh, so we're going to have a little conversation, and then what, right? It's completely left unspecified. In fact, Pearl has said that this is code for a disciplinary process in the public sector. So, in fact, what it really means is first you have a little talk, and then there are some measures to try to make you comply, and then after several warnings, if you still don't comply, then in fact you can be dismissed. Okay, one more warning after the first 2 weeks, and then in fact you can be dismissed from your job. Now, I find it interesting that this is not spelled out. So someone like me who does not know anything about the public service would not get upset about it. I just am confused by it, that it's completely, left sort of open. But I think that if that was written explicitly, many people in Quebec who might be pro-charter supporters because they're armchair xenophobes, they would like to have xenophobic feelings but don't really want like the full application of it to people, i.e. firing them. I think this, if that were spelled out clearly, it would not be obvious that people would support this. So I think one responsibility and one thing to make clear is that that is a real implication in terms of the enforcement. Okay, so having said that, and so again I say it's important to read it, but also obviously to talk with legal experts, people who know a lot more, about what the language actually involves. Okay, well, what are the obvious reasons, I think, to oppose this bill? I think there are 4 basic reasons. The first is that it is just fundamentally unjust, and we should not desire to live in a society which becomes more unjust, right? We don't have a perfect society already. We have many issues of justice, but so far, I've been reconciled to living in an imperfect society with the knowledge that our political leaders, as well as our society, are engaged with the common project of making a more just society. I think this is a step backwards in terms of violating fundamental individual freedoms of expression and freedom of religion. So that's just not on, and I think completely unacceptable. It should just be opposed for that reason alone. In addition, I think, with respect to the argument about secularism, in violating individuals' basic personal liberties, the proposed charter actually is incoherent and inconsistent with the main purposes and principles of a secular state and society. Just to highlight what the big chasm is on this, so I looked up, because I'm an immigrant to Canada as well as to Quebec, I thought, okay, what does Quebec want to say to new people? So I looked up the section on the Immigration Quebec website called Common Values of Quebec Society. This is the kind of common values they want all immigrants to, sort of subscribe to when they come to Quebec. And there, actually, the principle of state secularism is defined. And it's defined as meaning that the decisions and actions of the Quebec state and its institutions are independent of religious powers. Right? It's basically what Professor Burley was saying. Now, it seems to me that, all right, I agree that Pauline Moravas should not be making decisions based on phone calls to Rome or, other religious orders. But surely it's not obvious that respecting people's personal freedom to wear religious symbols reaches this basic secular principle, right? In what way, when somebody is wearing a religious symbol, are they somehow making decisions that are based on their religion as opposed to impartially and according to state standards, right? Obviously, there's another problem in which somebody could be, hypothetically, there could be someone who subscribes to a very, say, extreme religion who has no religious visible symbols. And they could be, in fact, serving you in a very partial way. But again, this kind of law cannot capture those people at all, right? So basically, banning people from wearing religious symbols just seems to be a completely arbitrary and ineffective way if you really care about the impartial delivery of public service. So in that sense, then, this regulation is totally disconnected, it seems, from the objective of ensuring that Quebec is a secular state. And in fact, I think in instrumentalizing secularism against fundamental personal freedoms, the Charter's provisions exceed the authority of a secular state and alienate those of us who are committed to a secular Quebec society. So my third argument is that the proposed Bill 60 forces competent individuals, in fact, to choose between their religious values and their desire to contribute to the common good of society. In this sense, there are obviously 2 problems. One that has already been discovered is these people will just experience discrimination, for example, in hiring policies, but also in why do they need to choose? There's also the consequential problem, which is that, in fact, our society needs people from all religions to work, and they need qualified workers in areas especially such as health and education. we're not exactly suffering from a huge, surplus of qualified people in these subsectors, right? So again, it seems like shooting oneself in the foot. I want a prosperous Quebec and a well-served Quebec. I want a public service that has competent workers. Why would I limit myself now based on very arbitrary considerations that have nothing to do with the competence of the worker? Fourth, I think that the proposed bill will in fact make the integration of new immigrants harder. That might seem obvious, but remember that one of the rationales of the whole thing is that it's supposed to help integration. The kind of Quebec I think people would want to be integrated into is the one that's depicted on the Immigration Quebec website, again under common values of Quebec society. And I read to you what the website says. It says, Quebec encourages exchanges between cultures and closer relations between communities, and recognizes what an enrichment diversity is. Moreover, everyone can freely choose their lifestyle, opinions, and religion while respecting the rights of others. Relationships between people are established with respect and tolerance and a climate of harmony. That's what it says on the website of Common Values of Quebec. So I'm thinking, wow, so somebody's supposed to come to Canada and to Quebec and think that's the kind of society I'm going to encounter. And then the first thing they're going to hear is, oh, you want to apply for a job in the public sector? Well, please take off your hijab. Then, so already what the state is saying is, we cannot offer you the respect and status that you deserve as a member of society, but we expect you to be tolerant of, everybody and see diversity as an enrichment. So I think it's just incoherent from this point of view. I think the other problem it poses for integration is that it assumes that the problem of integration is that the immigrants have problems adjusting, right? In fact, I think this entire bill shows a deep problem within Quebec society, a kind of acceptance of the changing face of Quebec, which is that it is already a pluralistic society. There are people of all religions buried in Montreal, I'm pretty sure, having gone to the cemetery recently. So, in fact, it's a pluralistic society already, right? So it's impossible to say that Quebec is just from one stream. Quebec has already many roots, and this bill, though, is about the insecurity of one group being one among many roots. I don't know how to deal with that insecurity except perhaps to remind people of, in fact, how vulnerable and insecure minorities are. So rather than the majority being able to act out its insecurities, perhaps people need to, cry a bit in public or something, because I think, it's easy to be angry, but actually I feel very sad. And I think actually that expressing one's vulnerability might actually make a difference. To say, look, we're actually even more vulnerable. It's not that we want to share values. We have no hope of sharing the heritage of the majority of Quebec, but we just don't want to be alienated. We don't want to belong deeply, but we just don't want a society that alienates us. And what greater sign of alienation can there be? So I'm going to end with this. What clear signal of alienation, rejection, and inferior status can the Quebec state make to its religious-minded citizens than to declare in a charter that because of their religious faith, their personal freedoms and rights can be subject to additional restrictions that are not faced by the majority or by those of us like me who have no religious affiliation. Thank you.